Is this a new clue in the search for Savannah Guthrie's mother? A Ring camera a few miles away from Nancy Guthrie's home capturing a man acting suspiciously at 3 and 5 a.m. a week before Guthrie was taken.
Darkness enveloped a quiet home in the city of Tucson on a late January night. There were no screams, no sudden bursts of panic, but a meticulously calculated crime was silently unfolding right before the eyes of the most modern technological devices. An 84-year-old woman carrying the pulse of an emergency medical device disappeared without a trace except for scattered drops of blood on the porch and a security system intentionally destroyed. The disappearance of Mrs.
Nancy Guthrie was not just an ordinary kidnapping case, but an haunting puzzle for the authorities. Let us pull back the curtain on the details of this mystery right now. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, hit like, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next dramatic case files. To understand the severity of this incident, we need to turn back time and look at the victim from the most realistic human perspective.
Mrs. Nancy Guthrie was not a young person fond of spontaneous trips or someone with an unregulated lifestyle. At 84 years old, her life was defined by daily repetitive habits, strict medical needs, and close bonds with her family members. She had a pacemaker, a device not only to sustain life, but also a signal station continuously reporting her health status. The fact that she left her home in the middle of the night without taking her phone is completely contrary to logic. The evening of January 31st passed peacefully after she spent time gathered with her loved ones. There were no signs of anxiety, no calls for help, and no psychological disturbances before she entered the house. Such ordinary moments happen millions of times every day all over the world and are often forgotten as soon as dawn appears. But for the Guthrie family, that was the last peaceful memory before a terrible nightmare struck. An unforeseen event cut through that flow of peace, turning the house into a crime scene full of unsolved mysteries. According to investigative documents released later, everything began to change in the early hours of February 1st. The doorbell camera system, a common surveillance tool intended to provide peace of mind for homeowners, captured a fleeting but haunting image. A figure appeared at the door carrying a backpack wearing gloves, with their face completely covered and notably carrying an object resembling a weapon. This individual did not have the clumsy or confused gestures of a petty thief accidentally passing by. Instead, they moved with great purpose, aiming directly at the recording device and proceeding to disable it immediately. The act of destroying the security camera was not merely a technical detail, it also revealed a lot about the psychology and level of preparation of the perpetrator. Knowing the exact location of the device, approaching it without hesitation, and handling it neatly proved that this person had carefully studied the terrain beforehand. This was not a spontaneous crime or an impulsive act lacking control. It was a detailed, calculated plan requiring patience, observation skills, and a certain degree of ruthlessness. When criminals act with such high control, it means they have prepared scenarios to deal with the authorities.
What do you think really happened in the short 30 minutes after the security system was disabled? The silence that enveloped the house after the camera was turned off was not peace, but a deadly void. Less than half an hour later, a second system stopped working, and this time it was a matter of life and death. The connection signal from Nancy's heart rate monitoring device completely disappeared. Two systems operating entirely independently of each other, one for home security and one for personal medical use, both went silent within an extremely tight time frame. The probability of this happening by coincidence is nearly zero. The fact that these two devices stopped working created a tight logical sequence of events, helping investigators narrow down the time frame in which the crime took place. It was an extremely short window of time, but enough for a stranger to intrude, overpower an elderly woman, and take her out of the place supposed to be safest. The scene inside the house the next morning further reinforced the hypothesis of a brutal kidnapping. Personal phones, wallets, items that anyone would take if they left the house voluntarily, all remained intact in their original positions. There was no packing of luggage, no sign of a voluntary departure. Investigators quickly discovered another important detail: the back door of the house had been left wide open. The open back door not only showed the entry point or the perpetrator's escape route, but also painted a specific direction of movement, a trail moving from the inside out. But what immediately turned this case from a concerning disappearance into a serious criminal investigation were the bloodstains found on the porch area. Subsequent test results confirmed a grim truth: it was indeed Nancy's blood. This physical evidence shattered any thin hope of an ordinary medical accident. At that point, the investigation was forced to change its entire initial approach. Authorities were no longer looking for an elderly person who might have wandered off. They were hunting someone who had committed an act of violence in the dark of night. The scene was strictly cordoned off, and hundreds of police officers, along with federal agents, were mobilized. They began working from the epicenter of the house, gradually expanding the search circle outward with the hope of finding even the smallest clue.
In cases where the scene is so tightly controlled, every object and every trace left behind, no matter how minor, can carry the weight of an answer. A glimmer of light appeared when the search force discovered a glove lying a few miles from the house.
This item had a shape and color strikingly similar to the glove used by the masked individual when disabling the doorbell camera.
In the field of modern criminal investigation, a piece of evidence capable of holding DNA is like a golden key that can swing open any mystery.
All attention immediately turned to the forensic testing center. The glove was analyzed meticulously and cross-referenced with a massive national database. However, the result returned was a total disappointment when no DNA match was found. That is the brutal reality of complex investigations where hope and disappointment constantly intertwine. From the public's perspective, people always expect an investigation to proceed in a straight line, where each clue leads to a new discovery, followed by the identification of a suspect, and finally a proper sentence.
But in reality, cases often move along a trajectory full of dead ends and invisible resistance.
A piece of evidence that seems like a decisive turning point eventually turns into a dead end, forcing investigators back to the starting line. The momentum of the investigation did not stop, but its speed certainly slowed down. While the physical evidence seemed to lead into the darkness, another development began to completely change the landscape of the case.
The volume of information from the public pouring into the investigative agency began to skyrocket as the case crossed local boundaries and became a focal point on national news.
Thousands of calls and tens of thousands of messages providing clues were sent every day. The investigative team faced enormous pressure in filtering information. Ignoring a small but accurate detail could lead to disastrous consequences, but the reality was that most sources lacked a basis, relying on unwarranted rumors about the event. Processing this massive volume of information required a huge expenditure of time and manpower. Time in kidnapping cases is never a neutral factor. It is the most dangerous enemy. The first days passed in a terrifying silence, and as the first week ended without any positive signs, a sense of insecurity began to spread widely. The public began to raise questions about the effectiveness of the investigation, while the victim's family faced immeasurable mental torture. As every path seemed blocked, the case began to shift in the public's perception. If you are interested in mysterious cases and want to update yourself with the deepest analyses, please take a second to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support is a great motivation for us to continue providing accurate information. Returning to the case, the absence of official conclusions created an ideal void for misleading messages to begin creeping in. This was also when the first ransom letters appeared, marking a new dark and complex phase. Initially, these messages had a very clear structure, directly targeting the victim's family and making very specific financial demands. What made these first letters particularly noteworthy was that they contained several details that had never been publicly announced in the media.
Possessing information not meant for the public proved the sender had a certain connection to the case, or at least was in a position close enough to grasp internal developments.
Famous journalist Nancy Guthrie, who is also a relative of the victim, later shared that the family believed in the authenticity of these initial messages. For families falling into tragedy, they always develop a sharp intuition to recognize what is a real threat and what is just a cruel scam. Was the police silence in the early days an investigative tactic, or simply a stalemate in the face of too many information streams? Investigators did not take these first letters lightly. They immediately tracked the path of the money, closely monitored all communication activities, and tried to determine if these messages could lead them to a specific location. The work process took place in silence to avoid alarming the kidnappers.
However, despite mobilizing the most advanced technological resources, these efforts still did not bring a final result. No location was confirmed, the victim remained missing without a word, and the identity of the one behind it remained an unknown. As time continued to stretch on, a strange change in the mode of communication began to appear, disrupting the investigative agency's entire assessment. New letters were no longer sent directly to the victim's family. Their target had shifted toward major media outlets. Not only did the recipients change, but the structure and tone of these messages were also completely different from the beginning. Consistency disappeared, replaced by confusing chaos and contradictions. One message claimed that Nancy had passed away, while another message, sent immediately after, declared that someone had just seen her still alive in the Sonora area. The appearance of the name Sonora, a state located right across the border from Mexico and only about 70 miles south of Tucson, threw a real bombshell into the investigation process. This geographical distance is not too far and could be traveled in a short time, but it carried extremely complex legal implications. Once a case shows signs of crossing national borders, all ordinary investigative procedures become exponentially more difficult. Issues of jurisdiction, international cooperation, and different legal systems created massive obstacles. A short distance of a few dozen miles suddenly became a deep abyss separating the authorities from the truth. Was the appearance of this new geographical factor actually an invaluable clue, or just a sophisticated decoy to mislead the authorities? For many analysts, providing a specific place name like Sonora in the letters could be a psychological trick intended to disperse police resources. However, the authorities could not subjectively ignore any hypothesis. A tiny detail, if ignored, could cost a human life. Therefore, the verification of this information had to be carried out, despite the difficulties surrounding it from all sides, even if it required costly interregional coordination. These contradictory messages turned the case from a search for criminal evidence into a battle against disinformation. The shift from a controlled state to an unstable environment created entirely new challenges. The work of the authorities was now not merely to distinguish between the truth and the unknown, but more difficultly, they had to separate the truth from lies created intentionally. Imposters began to appear, making the big picture even more blurred. The investigation was split into two fronts, one on the ground based on physical evidence and the other on controlling rumors in cyberspace. Former agent Tracy Walder, when analyzing this event, pointed out an extremely suspicious point regarding the timing of the final ransom letters. She noted that these messages appeared exactly on the day journalist Nancy Guthrie returned to television work after more than 2 months of absence due to the family tragedy. This coincidence was too perfect to be considered accidental. It suggested that the sender of the letters might not actually care about money, but his main goal was to attract public attention, exploiting the heat of the media to create a morbid fame for himself. This is typical behavior for those who like to manipulate the community's psychology. Furthermore, the amount of money requested in the letters sent to the press was much lower than the massive total reward of millions of dollars that the family and federal agencies had committed to giving anyone providing accurate information. This goes completely against normal criminal psychological logic. If a person actually held the victim's location and wanted to receive a ransom, they would choose a secure way to contact and receive the maximum amount rather than creating a loud drama that brings less financial benefit. This absurdity further reinforced the belief that the final messages were more of an effort to sabotage the investigative process than a real negotiation request. The conflicting information streams not only caused difficulties for the police, but also dealt extremely cruel psychological blows to the family members. Their emotions were stretched between two extremes, sometimes falling into total despair upon hearing the victim had passed away, other times flashing with a thin hope when there were reports she was still alive in Mexico. For the public, the case might just be a mystery story updated through daily news reports. But for the victim's family, there was no rest period. The silence of the investigative agency combined with the noise of the public created an extremely harsh environment. Parallel to the complex developments of the case, the internal local law enforcement agency was also facing a serious crisis of trust. The Pima County Board of Supervisors formally requested Sheriff Chris Nanos to explain issues related to leadership capacity and the operation of the Sheriff's Department within 10 working days.
Although this internal investigation did not directly affirm that the case had been handled incorrectly from the start, it appeared at the most sensitive time. When a shocking kidnapping case remains unsolved, any sign of instability in the leadership apparatus is enough to ignite public outrage. These administrative troubles unintentionally created another layer of fog covering the entire case. People were not only worried about the existence of a hidden culprit out there, but they also began to doubt the very ability of those in uniform to protect the community. Trust, an extremely important factor in calling for cooperation from the public, was gradually being eroded. Questions were constantly raised not only about the identity of the perpetrator, but also about the actual competence of those holding the responsibility to find the truth. Once trust has been cracked, every statement from the authorities is scrutinized through the lens of skepticism. Despite the surrounding troubles, we cannot deny that the origin of this case is still based on extremely clear physical foundations that cannot be erased by rumors. A real person appeared before the camera lens, the actions of interfering with a medical device actually happened, and the blood left on the porch was undeniable proof of a violent act. Authorities were not stagnant as public criticism suggested, mobilizing hundreds of detectives, analyzing detailed images from traffic cameras, or coordinating with retail corporations to trace the origin of the backpack, all showed tireless effort. The core issue did not lie in the police's lack of action, but in the fact that those actions had not yet connected into a complete picture. Each clue collected was like an individual piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle. Analyzing the direction of movement, tracking the timelines before the pacemaker app lost signal were all performed meticulously. But those pieces were still scattered, unable to create a specific name, a clear motive, or a final destination. This is the harsh nature of criminal investigation. The truth sometimes requires a level of patience that exceeds human limits. The fact that the case is gradually shifting into a quiet state does not mean it has been forgotten. On the contrary, the less information released to the outside, the more internal undercover investigative activities are taking place strongly and carefully. One of the hypotheses put forward is that the authorities are intentionally keeping silent about important discoveries, especially clues related to the Sonora area. This tactical silence is a necessary skill to avoid frightening the enemy. If the perpetrator believes he has succeeded in outsmarting the police, he might reveal a loophole in his next movements. However, the boundary between a clever investigative strategy and a real stalemate is sometimes very thin. Every single day that passes without new information further deepens the wound in the heart of the victim's family and sparks dissatisfaction in the community. The pressure of time now comes not only from preserving the victim's life, but also from maintaining social order. Contradictory messages from the media internal investigations targeting police leadership along with the family's desperation have created an invisible but extremely heavy pressure on those directly solving the case. The case warns the community to always be highly vigilant and not rely entirely on security devices. At the same time, be alert to fake news, avoid spreading misleading information that hinders the investigation and causes more pain to the victim. It can be said that Nancy Guthrie's case has gone far beyond the framework of an ordinary search and become a symbol for the clash between silent truth and noisy disinformation. Although everything is still submerged in a thick fog, the search has certainly never stopped. The initial evidence is still there, patiently waiting for the day it is completely connected. The blood on the porch, the silence of the doorbell system, and the disconnected heartbeat will forever be witnesses reminding us of a journey that is still unfinished. If you found this video provided deep insight, please remember to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next developments of other shocking cases.